North Country Congresswoman Elise Stefanik meets with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Stefanik using the trip to talk about efforts to defend Israel, and she says to reiterate House Republican support for Israel, which she calls the U.S.'s most precious ally. She also delivered a speech before Israel's parliament Sunday criticizing President Joe Biden's approach to the war in Gaza. It said Stefanik continues to be on the list of possible vice presidential candidates for former President Donald Trump.